Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to sort of flip back and forth between this and Gamecast, right, to see what's going on out there. It's, what are they, Pac-10, Pac-12, it's too much power. Though the hardy ones, I'm very, very pleased to have this opportunity. Let me get into it. I'm really going to try to, it's hard for Stanford professors to commit to not talk too much. But I'm going to try to keep this shorter so we can sort of listen to your concerns, to your thoughts, and really sort of talk over some of the things I'm going to talk about. I actually think that these are some of the big questions that face us in the coming decades. And of course, it's all over the media, right? That China's rise is going to change the world as we see it, right? You've probably seen this book in the kiosk in the airport, or in if you go to a bookstore anymore, when China rules the world. It's almost like it's fate accompli, right? It's a done deal. But looking at the ages of most of us in here, you guys probably all remember, right? The same thing was said about the Soviet Union in the 50s and the 60s, and where's the USSR today? And in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, in fact, when I was in school and grad school, was said about Japan. Everybody kept saying, why are you studying Chinese? You should be studying Japanese, right? They're going to dominate the world in the 21st century. Since 1990, Japan hasn't grown, zero. So what I want to argue sort of today is why we probably need to worry much, much more about a stagnating. And if China stagnates, I think it's going to collapse, and if China's collapse, I think it's going to have a huge impact on the world, and the world as we know it. That's what I want to sort of argue, that this is a possibility out there that we probably have to be just as much concerned about rather than its rise. So why is there this disconnect, right? So Martin Jacques talking about China burying us, and Scott Rozelle talking about a collapsing China. I think there's a couple ideas here. Mainly that China's development drive to transform itself from a poor, closed agriculture economy to a rich, modern one, we say that in one sentence. It's actually two very distinct phases. And all of these countries, the USSR, Japan, all went through this, and we were scared in phase one. Okay, that's when the books were starting to be read, and indeed the story of phase one, which is from poor to middle income, is one that's remarkable. In China, it was remarkable. In Japan, it was remarkable. In the Soviet Union, and this phase one, to go from poor to middle income, is one that starts with subsistence farming, with a socialist economy, with being very poor. This is when I got to China the first time. I had just graduated, somewhere across the bay, right? Yes. I'm one of these, we here we call it academic heaven, right? A Berkeley degree and a Stanford job. Exactly. Hey, you'll see my house. It's all red. All my sons have come here, and so I'm 1 year out of undergrad, and I get my first time to visit China, and this is what I see. I'm actually a master's student at Cornell, and China is a farming country. It's socialist. I'm visiting with commune leaders. People eat together in these communal kitchens, and it's very, very poor. 2 years later, I met my wife, who was a master's student at the University of California, Davis. This is her aunt's house in the richest province in China today. Her mother got out to the city in the 50s, but her aunt couldn't leave the countryside after that. It was extremely poor. This is one of her second cousins right here. So that's China in 1980, right? But what do you do in these very poor economies? You give them incentives and markets and open trade and basic education and new sources of jobs, on and on and on. What do you get? You get growth. Okay, now it's not easy. I mean, if it was so easy, we would have growth in Africa, we'd have growth in Latin America, and there are pockets of growth. But China did this. They did it. They put the package together, and they got 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, right? 10% for 30 years in a row. And this is the miracle that we're all seeing. This is what all the writers are writing about, that the New York Times like to report. From 1978 to 2004, China's economy increased by 10 times. It took us 100 years from 1870 to 1970 to grow by 10 times. So it's scary, right? It's actually doubled again since 2004. And so by 2010, China becomes a middle-income country, $4,000 per capita, and it's sort of proud to announce that we're ready to make the next step. Now, remember, I'm trying to think, what's the source of disconnect? Why shouldn't we be worried about what this? Because I think what people forget is that the factors, the policies, the engines that drive you from poor to middle income are very different than phase two, from middle income to high income. And to get the high income and to stay there, these are very different factors. So in other words, China's only halfway there, okay? The Soviet Union only got halfway there. Japan got most of the way there. I'll talk about Japan a lot more later. But today, China's goal is to become a rich, modern nation. But they still rank 50th place in per capita GDP. I mean, there's 50 countries between them and us. 150 million people live below $2 a day. And so, it isn't there yet. So what I'm going to really talk about for the rest of this time is talk about phase two. And it may be a more difficult job to get from middle income to high income countries. Since World War II, there's actually only been 11 countries that went from middle income to high income. It's very, there were a number, Western Europe, North America, Australia were rich countries before World War II, but since World War II, there's been a lot more countries that have hit middle income and stagnated, or hit middle income and collapsed. And so let's think about how China is doing in this second phase. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some growth theory 101. No quizzes. I was sworn not to give a quiz, but I'm going to talk a little about how growth happens, and ask the question: can more growth come from inputs in the coming decade? Labor and capital. This is what's driven China's growth in the past. Can China build an innovation-based economy? And to do so, you need higher education, you need venture capital, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to talk about this as the basis of trying to see how China is going to grow in the coming years. And then, as the economy slows, as it inevitably will, what are the consequences of a country that's extremely unequal when they're trying to make that last rise to, and we're going to talk about the threat that holds there. So that's the strategy. Over the next decade or two, all good economists predict slowing growth for China. We should not be surprised that they're only growing at 8%. I mean, wouldn't we love to grow at 8%? It's a crisis in the Chinese economy that they're only growing, but they shouldn't be surprised. Now, Justin Lin, who is a very good friend of mine, he just stepped down as the president of, as the head economist at the World Bank, predicts that China for the next 30 years can grow at 8%. 8% for 30 years more. The China National Statistical Bureau used to predict 5%, and then Justin said 8%, so they said 7.8%. But good economists know that this is just wishful thinking, and that Eigen Green, the World Bank, McKinsey, there are at least 40 projections sort of based on true growth theory that shows China is going to be, in the next 2 decades, growing at an average of 4%. What that means is 888, 777, 666, 555, 444, 33. I will almost guarantee you that. I mean, that is how countries grow after they hit middle income. And I'm going to tell you why. This is a paper by a colleague of mine named Alwyn Young. He's a University of Chicago economist. And he looked back, he just published a paper where he looks back at this 10%, 10%, 10% growth for the last 30 years. So here's the 10% growth, right? That got China's economy rolling and I was so worried. You can break that growth into 2 parts, okay? The first part of the growth of China's growth has come from inputs. This is more labor and more capital. So labor, labor, capital, capital. Land doesn't change, right? The only 2 things that can drive growth are labor and capital. And you can see 6 percentage points a year for the last 30 years has come from just the population getting bigger, lots of little babies becoming lots of little workers. And that's driven a lot of the growth. And a lot of capital coming into the country from a base that's very low. So you put more capital on there, the country grows. You put more people into the factories, the country grows. And you can indeed very, very fast growth. The other part is called TFP. This is the magic. This is same people, same capital, same land, same everything. Output goes up, becoming right. It's you know you used to have a computer this big and it ran real slow. Now we have a computer this big and it runs real fast. Same plastic, same wiring. It works much better. You get more output from it. So productivity growth. Rich countries, and I'm going to show you, like the United States, we grow 100% from productivity growth. All of our growth comes from productivity. We've grown 3% a year since World War II, all of it with about the same labor force, about the same capital stock. It's all come from productivity growth. So that's what advanced countries do. But you can see that in China it has 4% a year, from 4 percentage points a year come from TFP growth. So let's decompose from the past and see how these are going to change over the future. That's really what we're trying to do here. And of course, the big thing is China's population. China doesn't have enough people. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, there's 1.3 billion people. If anybody's been to Beijing or Shanghai or any of the big cities there, that's the one thing you come away. There's just so many people. There aren't enough people to keep fueling growth, okay? Because here's the birth rates going down. And this is not the one-child policy. Here's the one-child policy. This fall, since this time, is basically as people get rich, they don't want to have more kids. They invest in quality, not quantity. And then, of course, that's driving it. Here's China's population pyramid. This is why, right, you can see these are age cohorts from 0 to 4, 5 to 9. Here are middle-aged. These are the people who are in the factories. And of course, 20 years ago, these were all babies, right? And now they graduated into the labor force and produced a lot of output, okay? So the labor coming in has produced a lot of that output. But you can see the problem is that the number of babies being born every five-year age cohorts are 60 million less. They used to have 120 million babies born every 5 years. Now there's less than 40. Okay, so there's just no more young kids coming behind them. There's going to be no more growth from labor. And you can see, the other part, you can see this from his aging profile. These are the age cohorts here, and here's wonderful middle age, and China's here right now where and moving in this direction. So the number of old people is becoming a larger and larger part of the economy. And you can see by 2030 or so, they're going to have that blue aging profile where almost 40% of the people will be over 65, will not be working, will be consuming, won't be investing. This is exactly where Japan hit in 1990. So China's age profile in 2030 is going to be Japan's age profile in 1990. Japan has not grown since 1990. A lot of economists think in no small part due to this aging shift. It's just that, if you're lucky enough to be 65 and have some assets, you spend it on yourselves, right? And you don't, you're disinvesting, and it causes the economy to slow, among other things. And so what all this means is that the number of young people are going down, the number of elderly are going up, and what happens here, this is a very difficult chart. This is the hardest chart. This will not be on the final. Okay. But this is a very important chart. This shows the aging profiles of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan on the left. And this is when the number of people in the labor force peaked. Right? And so as more people graduate to retirement, that number starts coming down from the 80s and 90s in Japan. It's later in the 90s and 2000s in South Korea. What's on the right is the percentage of manufacturing sector. This is when, so in the 50s and 60s, when Japan had all these young people in the factories, they produced everything in the world. Remember the Japanese transistor radios and the widgets from Japan, and we thought it was, down here, now it's Sony's and Toyotas, right? That we like. And then what happened is all the Japanese manufacturing went to Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. That's when they had all their young people in the factories. As soon as these economies start to age, then it moved to China. Now it's going to be China's turn. And China is exactly at its peak right now. So China is at its peak, and from now on, there's going to be fewer and fewer people in those factories. That means wages are going to rise. Low-wage manufacturing is going to go away. And so the conclusion is, as the demographic dividend dissipates, the number of new workers fall, inputs go down, manufacturing as share of the total economy fall, growth will slow. It has to, just by the way we calculate growth. The other part I'm going to do much quicker is capital. Look at the rise of capital. Capital, transport, post, electricity. Mao Zedong, for the 30 years that he ruled China, built irrigation systems. He didn't build roads, he didn't build airports, he didn't build electricity, he didn't build telephones. He wanted China to be able to survive a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so he didn't build any infrastructure. China suffered a lot. Well, as soon as Deng Xiaoping took over, he's built and built and built, and that's had growth. It's been behind this phenomenal growth. But if all of you've taken Econ 1 from John Taylor or John's predecessor, you remember this thing called diminishing marginal returns. Basically what that is you build one high-speed rail and you can really increase productivity. You build your second high-speed rail and it doesn't do very much. And so you get diminishing marginal returns. It's like the United States is we actually have more direct investment coming from outside the world into the United States than any other country in the world. Yet it contributes almost zero to growth. Because our capital stock is so huge, is we add the most investment from everywhere in the world on top of that, and it really doesn't push us up anymore. 0.01%. And that's going to happen to China. That's by definition. China's going to continue to invest, but it's going to become a smaller and smaller part of the base, and they're going to get no more real growth from capital. So growth from labor is done, growth from capital is done, growth from inputs is a done thing. So because of this is going to go from 666, 555, 444, 332. By 2025, it's zero. They're going to have no more growth from inputs. Okay? And so this is, what's left? Well, China wants to become a modern country, and modern countries grow by productivity growth. Let's now take this productivity. 4% a year, that's not bad. If we've grown at 3% a year in the 90s, 2.5% a year since World War II, China's growing at 4% a year from productivity. Hey, that's pretty good, but the question is, where does that come from in a poor middle-income country, and is it sustainable? Well, you can see I've taken this, see the 4% here. Now I'm going to shift this up to this axis. There's the 4 percentage points. And I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. This productivities, remember, so the same labor force, the same capital, they get more output. It comes from 3 sources. Industrial TFP is what I just talked about, right? It's making your factories more efficient and getting more output from the same amount. This is what drives the U.S. Agriculture TFP, this is when your seeds get better and you get more crops for the same fertilizer and the same water. And then the last thing is a shift effect. And you can see the shift effect has been half of the TFP growth, 22 percentage points, so about a 20% of China's growth has come from the shift effect. So I'm going to tell you what is a shift effect, and let's ask, can China grow on this shift effect in the future, or is it a one-time only effect? So the shift effect is actually really easy. Here's a person, right? Ears, nose, hair, right? Farming in a field, producing about 6 bags of grain a year. Okay, that's what they produce out there. Very small plots. But now they say, ha-ha, I got a better opportunity. So they lock their door or pile rocks up in front of their door. They go get on a taxi or a train, okay, and they move into the city. Yes, yeah, what city, right, exactly. And they get a job in the factory or on a construction site. Same person, okay, same person. And they used to produce 6 bags of grain a year. Now they produce a container of clothes a month, right? Same person, much more productive, right? That's TFP growth. That's growth from the shift effect, shifting people from rural to urban, okay? The United States grew all through the 1800s and 1900s by the shift effect, right? After World War II, basically, most of the people had already moved to the city, and we didn't grow from the shift effect anymore. Let's see about China. So where did that go? My collaborators and I, over the last 30 years, have been doing a survey every 5 years and tracking where China's rural labor force is going. And 100% is 100% of the rural labor force. That's 500 million people. Okay, so there's 500 million people in this graph, and the black down there, the dark gray line, is the number of rural people. These are the guys who are out farming, who are working off the farm in a factory. And you can see in the 1980s, almost no one was. Everyone, the white part of the graph, everyone was basically farming, subsistence farming, just dirt poor, living off the land. But look at over the last 30 years now, 70% of these 500 million people, that's 300 million people or more, now have moved to the city. And they're working in factories, right? Everything I wear, now, this is the Stanford alumni, we have some wealthy colleagues out there who don't wear things made in China, but, a social science professor does. And everything I wear was made in China, right? And it's these guys who make it, right? And 60%. Now we're going to ask the question, can it keep coming? Is it coming to an end? What this graph, these are the same data here as in this graph, but I'm going to look at different years and the cohorts. So look at the 16 to 20-year-olds, and that says how many percent of all 16 to 20-year-olds in 1990 were working off the farm. So 25% or so, 23%, 25%. 75% or so were just working on the farm. So they were working with dad on the farm. Let's see, by 2007, 75%, now they're 17 years older, right? They're 20 years older now. There used to be 25. Now, 3 out of 4, 75% of them are working in the city. Okay? Same people, now most of them. But the most important fact is this one. Look at the new young people. the new young people, all of them are working in the city. They all left. I was introduced by Mr. Pearson, and he was telling you how I've taught in overseas studies program a couple times. It's on the Peking University campus. It's a great facility. We have terrific students. What I always do, since I do rural China, I always take the kids. Helen Bing gives us a trip a year, a 3 or 4 day trip, and I always take the kids out to the rural areas so they see the real China. And it's like, oh God, we got to go with Professor Rozelle to the rural China and sit down and you know, we have lunch in a cave. You know, there's still 20 million people that live in caves, and then we walk up the hills to their terraces. And actually, at the end, we have a great time, and we always have roast a lamb, and they eat with their hands, and it's a great trip. But before I go. With these, last time I went in 2010, I took 39 Stanford undergrads on this trip. I took out 39 100 yuan bills. 100 yuan is $16 now. So $16 for an undergrad, that motivates, right? Right? You probably remember that. I tell them, when you guys go with me to the rural areas, if you can find one young man between the ages of 16 and 30, that 100 yuan bill is yours. And of course, that's all they do for 3 days is look for. And guess what? I've never given away any money because everyone's gone. They're all gone. So what's the point? What's the point of this? One, all young people in the labor market have already shifted. Two, there's going to be fewer and fewer of those young people in the future, right? What this all means is the shift effect is gone, okay? The shift effect is gone. So they're not going to grow by inputs. They're not going to grow by the shift effect. Well, what about agriculture TFP, right? You think China is a farming country, and indeed, here's some work that I did for the International Rice Research Institute, the International Wheat and Maize. We looked at the productivity gains of China over the last 30 years. And same seed, same land, same farmers, they're getting more output, okay? Great productivity growth. That's very positive. This is why China exports and imports about the same amount. They aren't causing the world food crisis, at least yet. And so this is very good growth. But the problem is today, agriculture is only 9% of the economy. 2020, it's only going to be 5% of the economy. So if you grow 2% a year in 5% of the economy is zero, right? You don't get growth because agriculture is such a small part of the economy. So it's not going to grow by agriculture TFP. So that leaves one thing. It leaves productivity in the industrial and service sectors. Okay? This is how we grow. So can China, grow this way? So let me summarize a little and try to bring this all home. So China is going to have to grow in the future by innovation-based productivity growth, and because they want to become, and they're moving towards becoming a modern economy like the U.S. or Japan. And so these are the graphs we've just been talking about, and we know this is going away, and we know most of this TFP is going away. So let's see how the U.S. has grown. So here's the U.S. since World War II. For 60 years, we grew at 3% a year. None of that by inputs, zero. Little tiny bit of immigration, a little bit of foreign direct investment, but not very much. We grew from Silicon Valley. This is, I would say half of this is Stanford University, right? Yes, we truly do contribute a lot to this, and the higher education system in general. But look at Japan. Here's 1990 to 2000. Remember, Japan's going to bury us. This is a graph of Japan in 1980. 10% growth, but it was all from inputs and all from shift effect. After 1990, the inputs were gone. Japan couldn't grow their innovation-based economy, their creative economy has not been driving them, so Japan's had almost zero growth since then. Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, this is a very interesting graph from a guy named Yujiro Hayami. This is Hayami's last paper. Hayami is the only Japanese economist that's ever been nominated for the Nobel Prize. And he does lots of work, sort of why countries grow. And this particular one looks at the ratio of US to Japan GDP per capita. And so the US is 100%, right? And then this is Japan in 1890, right after the Meiji Restoration. Japan's only 20% of the U.S. economy, right? Japan is really poor, and the United States is a rich, growing, young economy. After World War II, here's the miracle growth, 30 years of 10% growth of Japan, right? By 1990, Japan almost catches us. Okay, they've almost caught up, right? We're having trade wars and Japan, and you can see, and here's what the New York Times is saying, right? And they're going to keep going, and by 2030, we're going to be subservient to them. But what happened after 1990? We saw no growth. The U.S. continues to grow on our internet boom, on our I-revolution, on all the other changes we make in the economy. Japan, the United States grows, Japan falls. Today, Japan is less than 70% of the U.S. economy and falling. Now, I have a colleague at the Freeman Spogli Institute, the Institute for International Studies. His name is Tom Finger. He was the head of intelligence for 3 or 4 administrations, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and even the first of the Obama administration for more than 20 years. And Tom is really a student of China. And he always says the Chinese government has 2 sources of legitimacy: growth and nationalism. Growth and nationalism. And today, growth is 90%. Everybody, you know, they do polls of the Chinese government, of Chinese citizens about the government, and 60% of the people say, we're a democracy. You know, we love our country. You know, we love our government. The government is good. But that's only when they're growing at 10% a year. Once that growth starts to slow, what Tom is worried is this nationalism phase is going to grow with it in the same way that Japan. So if they took this route, what do you think that the Chinese government is going to do? You know, they are militarized, unlike what Japan is today. So this comes to really the last question I want to talk about today, and it's, will China be able to produce growth like the U.S., or will it be more like Japan? If it's like Japan, I think that we're going to get slowing growth and rising nationalism. So what are the fundamentals of innovation? You know, we just look around us, right? A vibrant university system, a creative venture capital sector, good IPR, and lots of research and development expenditures. So let's look at these one at a time very quickly. Chinese higher education system. You know, they produced more engineers and scientists than the whole world combined. That was in the New York Times a month ago, right? It's part of this we're going to bury you type of thing. But is all that glitters gold? A defining feature of China's education system is that to get into any college, you have one and one only thing you have to do. That's pass the Gaokao, or pass the college entrance exam. It's a super SAT test. You know, it's a super, everything depends on your SAT, and nothing else matters. This is very much like Japan, by the way. Once you get into college, of course, students are more or less guaranteed a good job, very much like Japan. They restrict college admissions. So in a system like this, these kids work really hard, memorize to their SAT vocabulary. I remember that. And what do they do once they get into college? Well, I have a student who's a PhD from the economics department, named Hongbin Li, one of China's best development economists now. He's a Stanford alum. And he did surveys of third and fourth year college students, and then alumni who have been out 2 years, so the class of 2010 alumni. And what he found was there's a zero correlation between a student's grade in China and their salary. Okay? So it doesn't matter how good you do in school. In fact, your income is completely unrelated to that. However, there's a positive and significant correlation between a student's level of English. The better their English is, the higher their income. It's actually quite a high R-squared. It's about 0.29. So people who have good English do well. Okay. So now those were the alumni interviews. Then he came to the third and fourth year students, and he found that outside of class, college students in China only study 9 hours a week. Clearly, it's a school without quizzes, okay? Right, exactly. My Stanford students saw this and they said, Professor, last night I spent 9 hours on your assignment, you know? And so, now 9 hours, they still spend 9 hours, but what do you think of this 9 hours, what do they spend 8 hours doing? Of course, they study English, right? So they're studying 1 hour a week. 1 hour a week, 40 hours a year, 160 hours a year on their major. These hundreds of thousands of engineers that are graduating every year, they aren't very well trained. So in general, little appears to be taught in China's colleges, perhaps because of the restricted nature of the system. But you know, maybe to grow, you don't need everyone. Maybe you just need a Stanford College of Engineering, right? So how does the Chinese Stanford College of Engineering? These were actually done by Stanford undergrads who were in my OSP class. We were asking the same question. And we went to Peking University and Tsinghua, the two elite universities in China, and we interviewed 453 College of Engineering students. And then we came back and we interviewed 350 Stanford, Berkeley, and UC San Diego College of Engineering students. Asked them the exact same questions. And what we asked them was, when you graduate, are you interested in starting or joining a startup company? And look at this. I mean, you know, see, of course, 65% of Stanford and Berkeley students said yes. Yeah, that's probably not very surprising. 50% of Chinese students said yes. Wow, they really want to innovate, right? I mean, that's actually, it was surprising, but it was like, maybe China can make it. However, we went to engineering students 2 years out, okay, just like Hongbin's saying, 2 years out, we asked them, what are you actually doing? Well, not all those 65%, you know, they get a good offer from McKinsey, you know, or they go into the Peace Corps or something like that, and actually only 22%, but still one quarter of the College of Engineering students from Stanford, Berkeley, UC San Diego joined startups. I mean, that's actually a very high. What do you think the actual number of people 2 years out who joined startups in China? 3%. Almost no one. So what did they do? Guess what? They joined the government. I know, exactly. Exactly. It's like, who would join the government? You know, of course, you know, I said this, you know, and this guy is, you know, he just got a clerkship from the School of Law, got a clerkship, you know, with the Supreme Court Justice, right? And he said, well, does that count as government? You know, exactly. So that's the 5% in Stanford. So this is what's happening, right? Is the government is taking. Now, can the government innovate? That's the question. Now, why is this? No, I mean, yeah, obviously, our government has problems, and okay. So, why is this the case? I mean, this is just the final conclusion of this of the surveys by my Stanford students. They actually found the problem was availability of scholarships, internship, research funding, mentoring, startup venture capital funds. You know, is almost non-existent in China, while we have lots and lots of it available here in the U.S. And so that this in some smart, and of course the government, it's the demand side. The government is trying to attract and capture the elite in China. They don't want, them out forming their own political parties or other things. And so, okay, so the scorecard on innovation. No. It doesn't have a vibrant education system. I don't care how big it is. It's not there yet. It can change, but startup friendly. Well, we don't need to talk about IPR. What about research and development funding? Throughout the 80s and 90s, China's R&D investment was way down. U.S. invests about 2.5% a year in R&D expenditures. OECD suggests countries spend 2%. Last year, China hit 2% of GDP in R&D funding. So R&D funding, they're putting a lot of money in there. The question is it being spent wisely? Well, a large share of new R&D investment is being directed towards toward the government. They're not only bringing the College of Engineering students in, they're taking their own R&D investments with them to state-owned enterprises. These are big state-owned monopoly firms. We call them SOEs. And they're creating what they call the internal incubators that the Chinese government is going to pick winners, pillars. The Japanese call them pillar industries, and they're going to try to drive growth through the government. So the important question is, can they spell? What's the role of these SOEs in the economy? Only 3% of enterprises in China are SOEs. They control 30% of the economy and growing. Now, the problem is, we try to fit forward is this is even a bigger emphasis on these state-owned enterprises than Japan. Japan had a pillar industry strategy. Why isn't Japan spending any more money on R&D? That's because they're spending it all on supporting the pillar industries that they picked out 30 years ago. 43% of Japan's budget goes to the Fiscal Investment and Loan Program, the FLIP. FLIP in Japan is our Tarp. Right? So this was the Obama-Bush money to keep the banks afloat, right? Our TARP program took up 3% of GDP, of the budget. It rose to 5% for a very short time. 43% of the budget for the last 20 years has gone to support these crumbling pillars. This is why Japan is not growing. So it looks bleak, right? I mean, it's a rigid education system. The innovation fundamentals aren't in place. The government commitment to pillar industries aren't there. China is aging. What will China look like in the late 20s? We've already seen Japan. It's going to look like in the late 2020s as Japan looked in 1990, right? All these old people who aren't going to be investing, who are going to be consuming and not driving it forward. So if even China continues to grow at the pace that most economists believe optimistic, right? 888, 777, 666, this is what we were talking about. By 2025 to 2030, right when China's economy probably will be really slowing down, their income per capita is only going to be 60% of Japan's in 1990. So they're going to be much poorer than Japan when Japan stopped growing. Anybody know, if anybody spends time in Japan today, my son loves, Japanese cartoons and Japanese video games, and this is a 2005 grad from the economics department, and he spends all his nights, doing. He actually works for a League of Legends, right? But he just said, and when I was talking about this, he says, you know what Japanese culture is today? Japanese culture is, yeah, we aren't growing, we aren't getting any better, but let's just be happy. We're good enough, okay? And that's become sort of the Japanese way to deal with 20 years of stagnation. But China is going to stagnate at 60% of that level, one. Two, it's going to have much, much, much higher inequality. Japan, everybody enjoyed the growth in Japan. Japan's inequality in the 50s and 60s was very low. We measure inequality with something called a Gini. The Gini was 30. The Gini was 30 in Japan. That means that most people enjoyed income. The distribution was very tight. The richest and the poorest weren't very. The United States is 43. Okay, so ours is actually pretty high, right? But we're 30% higher than Japan. So what's the implication? Well, when China's growth was high, all enjoyed growth. Inequality was low. When Japan's growth stagnated, the nation was hurt. All suffered relatively equal. Okay, and so people pulled together, and Japan remained stable, even though with no growth. Now, how high is China's inequality? I'm going to list a bunch of these middle-income countries. These are the aspirees, right? We all know them, the Brazils, the Malaysias, Thailand, Turkey, right? These are countries that want to become OECD members, right? The interesting thing is all of these inequalities are very high. Those are these Gini ratios. Above 40 is like the US. 50 is extremely high, okay? Brazil is 54. Now, these are really, really high levels of inequality. The interesting fact is in some of the countries that might make it, the Brazils and the Chiles and the Costa Ricas in the world, even though they're very high, is that this inequality is coming down because the government finally figured out that you can't go from middle income to high income with high levels of inequality. The best thing I do is take Chinese leaders on trips to Brazil and get them to sit down with Brazilian leaders and listen to the Brazilian leaders say, you got to tax the rich and transfer to the poor, and you have to do it productively. And it's not until they go that they get it. So where's China at in this whole thing? China is 50 and rising. China soon will have the most unequal country in the whole world, in a major country in the whole world. This is really sort of scary, right? Because the question is it inevitable that developing countries that are growing fast and achieve middle income status always continue to grow, become rich? And the answer is no, right? We have Argentina, or Iraq was a development star in the 50s and 60s, and look at it today. Mexico, before our eyes, is in crisis, right? All of these countries hit middle income status, have stagnated or fallen. So what's the problem of trying to move from middle to high income with such high levels of inequality? A lot of it has to do with the slowing growth, right? 888, 555, 333, and the stability of a country. As growth slows, can all individuals, did they share in the rising prosperity? And when it slows, will they take action because their small part of the pie, which has always been small, gets taken away or reduced? Will they take actions that will slow growth further, indeed a vicious cycle, right? So this is China's real challenge. And there are fundamental questions. Can China transform itself like a South Korea or a New Zealand or an Ireland and go from middle income to high income? By the way, these countries that made it, they all had very low inequality rates as they took off. Or will China become a Mexico, Argentina, and Tunisia? Like I said, the logic of the argument is one that depends a lot on China's level of income and inequality in 2020s. Japan survived the fact that its per capita incomes were very high, much higher than China's will be in 2025, and Japan's inequality was very low. Just summarizing that. So what's China's inequality going to be like in 2025? This is what my group, the Rural Education Action Project, is worried about. And it goes like this, and this is how Chinese leaders respond to everything up till now. Sure, it's low, but we don't worry about inequality now. We worry about inequality in 2025. It's going to come down and go away. This is their hopeful thinking. Well, I like to examine the question, what will China's inequality be like in 2025, by referring to something I call the iron law of development economics, and that's today's human capital inequality among children. Look at the inequality of health, nutrition, education. That will determine tomorrow's income inequality. Okay? Today's income inequality is high. Add on today's human capital, health, and education inequality. That will determine tomorrow's income inequality. And then very closing, I just want to very quickly do one more thing, and that's look at human inequality today in China. And what I want to do is to look at poor areas. This is where my group works. Every summer, we take about 10 Stanford interns out to these really poor areas. I take my OSP classes out there. And when they get out there, it's a place in China where only about 20% of the population lives, but 35% of the school-aged children live. People in the cities have 1 kid or 0 kids. People in the poor rural areas have 3 kids. So almost more than a third, 40% of young kids, and of course, today's children are tomorrow's workers. There's 50 million kids in these schools out there. And what's happening out there? Well, they're getting elementary school education. Okay, every kid goes to elementary school in China today. This is better than India, better than Africa. But the problem is, while such a system of putting kids in school, teaching them to read a little, do a little math, and discipline, this might make fundamentally numerate and literate a discipline for it. It's really good for unskilled factory labor. It's not sufficient to provide the tools for a healthy, inclusive economy in phase 2. While all kids don't need to go to college, every kid in China needs to be going to high school. Every kid needs to learn math, language, English, science, computers. However, only 40% of junior high grads in poor rural areas go to academic high school. Look at this right here. South Korea, successful moving from middle income to high income, was educating everyone in high school when their women and men in the factories were making 50 cents an hour. Everybody was going to high school. Look at Mexico today. In the 1980s, okay, is most of these Mexican poor urban, poor rural work weren't going to high school. Today, those have dropped out of the labor force and they're part of the drug cartels. They're part of the organized crime that is basically predating on Mexico and forcing the country into crisis. The difference between Mexico and China today is exactly the same. Mexico in the 80s, China today, except this gap is 100 million children going through the school system that barely can read or write. How are they going to function when the economy is demanding $10 an hour? I'm going to end right here in just showing that, you know, the system is leading to dropouts. The system is leading to one where kids are in schools that are like this, and this is supposed to be the country that's going to bury us. Can China solve this problem? Yes. What can they do? What my group does is we test solutions. We work with our Chinese collaborators. We work with the government to try to show how to take schools like this and turn them into schools like this. People say, why are you working in China? Why aren't you working in East Palo Alto? Well, I think Stanford should work in East Palo Alto. Stanford should work in West Oakland. Stanford should work in Hunters Point. But as President Hennessy says, we're an international university and every person is in our mandate. And as I tried to convince today, I think that it's just about as important to help kids go from here to here and become a productive member of society, reduce inequality, so China, as growth slows, continues to grow into the future, and they aren't going to be driven by nationalism, that they can grow steadily and become a part of the world's family of nations. That's to our benefit. Helping these kids is to our benefit. It's also to their benefit and to the benefit of healthy China. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you very much. The question is, do the Chinese leaders know about this? And if they know about it, do they have political will to do something about it? I think the answer is most of them don't think about it. And if they do, it's 20 years out there. How hard is it for us in a democracy to make investment decisions for health, education, infrastructure, and Social Security that affect, we worry about 4 years from now, right? And Chinese leaders worry about 5 years. They get reappointed every 5 years. And so that's a real problem. When you take them to these other places and talk about it, there's lots of interest in it. I mean, they say, wow, we've never thought about this. So I think it's more of an ignorance, but even if it wasn't, they're going to have a strong leader step up to the plate and do that. Question?
I'm very concerned about their military aspirations.
Yeah, me too. And I think I worry more if growth slows and their legitimacy becomes 100% based on nationalism. I gave this talk to a group of 50 of the top administrators and officials and leaders from the southern province of Guangdong, right around Hong Kong. They were picked to come to Stanford for a 3-week executive program. I gave this thing and they said, why are Americans so afraid of China? This is them saying, these guys are smart guys, they were academics, they said, China has never attacked another country ever in our history, right? Now, we demanded tribute, but they were truly puzzled. I'm trying to let you see what's inside their mind. So their buildup of military is sort of, we want to protect our borders. This is what the citizens think. I'm not saying this is what the military thinks. Now, I think the danger is, let's say they're doing that. They're growing now at 10%, 10%, 10%, 8%. They're doing it just to protect their borders so China will have integrity. But now what happens is growth goes, there's high inequality, organized crime rises, growth goes to zero or starts to fall. What are they going to use that military for? So I am concerned about it. And I think it has a lot to do with growth. Yes. It's going to be replaced by, today, it'll just be replaced by another dictatorship, right? By factions, inside factions. China's leadership is fairly cohesive right now. I think what people worry about is slow growth, people go to the streets, they can't make decisions to get the economy going, and then now a faction comes up and says, I can push them over, and I probably need the military to help me. It'll probably be a military dictatorship. It's way out of this economist's area of expertise. But Tom Finger thinks a lot about this, and our CSAC, the Center for Strategic Arms Control, talks a lot about this. You should visit their website. If you email me, I'll get you in touch with some people there. The figures. Oh, yes. It's hard to lie with figures over and over and over and over again, right? Because of the law of, sort of compounding, right? China's grown at that amount. Sure, but I think that China has grown a lot. Just look at the number of buildings you see, right? It changes. It's amazing. Whether it's a plus or minus factor of 30%, I don't think it probably matters. But I think when you're trying to do good planning, that's when you run into problems, right? You can, and this is part of the problem. Going from phase 1 to phase 2, if you put in 10 yards of concrete or 9 yards of concrete in that road, it's still a road, right? The problem is now you want to become an electronics capital of the world. There's no there's no IPR, and so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's in phase 2 that we worry about the reliability of figures. Can planning help set an environment so the private sector can go forward? It's a big problem. Yeah, and yes, and lots of people comment on them all the time. The last one? Oh yes. So it's the same sort of, how about if we can just tap savings, can't we grow forever? Justin Lin, has 8% growth. He says that's going to drive growth for the next 30 years. The problem is the reason those factories are moving from coastal to inland is they're getting good deals on land, and they're getting good tax breaks. So it's not this. You saw it. 69% of the people are already working in the factory. Labor moves freely.
But won't that improve the disparity?
No, no, because the people I'm taking to rural China, the people I'm taking our students to see in rural China, they're all gone. They already are making that wage. They happen to be 2,000 miles from home, right? But labor is very, very fluid, right? And so that these guys move from coast to east and the wage is the same. Yes. Okay. I think that I was thinking what you mean. Will more people work? More people. I think it's good for developing the West. It is a good thing. Low-wage manufacturing is going to go to Indonesia, Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh, right, and other little countries. Some to Latin America and Africa. China is not going to. If China is successful and continue to grow, China isn't going to be the low-wage manufacturer of the world soon. So 5 years, 10 years. There's still logistics. They dominate with logistics. It's hard to move whole industries. But yes, but as they move there, it's actually good for communities. It's not good for wages. Wages are the same, but there are lots of spillovers. That's a good point. I got it.